The first time Margaret Hayes saw the valley that would become her home, she knew she had 3 weeks to build shelter before Dakota Territory. Winter killed her and her 8-year-old son. It was late October 1867, and she stood on a slight rise overlooking 40 acres of prairie grassland that had cost her every dollar she had. $200 saved over 5 years of taking in sewing, pinching pennies, planning escape from the cholera-ridden city. Behind her, the wagon held their possessions: tools, canvas, a few boards, seed for next spring, and the determination of a woman who'd buried her husband to cholera in St. Louis and refused to bury her future with him. Beside her, Daniel shifted his weight, small for 8 but steady in ways that broke her heart. He'd grown quieter since his father's death 6 months ago, more watchful, as if he was learning to carry weight too heavy for his size. "Mama," he said, voice careful, "there aren't any trees." Margaret looked at the endless rolling prairie, golden grass moving in wind that cut like knives even now in autumn. Daniel was right. The nearest timber was 3 miles north, a line of cottonwoods along a creek. She could see perhaps 24 trees total, none large, none close. Conventional wisdom said you needed timber to build a cabin, logs for walls, planks for roof, wood for everything. But Margaret had spent the wagon journey reading a book she'd found in a St. Louis boarding house, a surveyor's manual that included descriptions of structures built by miners, railroad workers, and desperate settlers in treeless country. One entry had caught her attention: earth-bermed, arched shelters used successfully in regions lacking timber. Principle of the arch distributes weight, requiring less structural lumber. Earth banking provides superior insulation. The manual had included rough sketches. Margaret had studied them until she could see the structure in her mind: a half-buried curved shelter built into the ground itself, using earth as both insulation and structural support. Now, looking at the treeless valley, she understood that innovation wasn't about having ideal resources. It was about using what you had. "You're right," she told Daniel. "There aren't many trees, so we're going to build something different." She saw his face, confused but trusting. He was too young to carry this weight, but he'd have to anyway. That was frontier life. That was their life now. "We're going to build into the ground," Margaret explained, gesturing at the slight hillside near a small creek. "Like a root cellar, but bigger. An arched roof that sheds snow and uses earth for warmth." "Will it work?" Margaret heard the real question underneath. "Will we survive?" "Yes," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "It'll work." She spent the first day planning and the second day digging. The site she chose was on a gentle south-facing slope about 50 yards from the creek. South-facing meant winter sun. Near the creek meant water access. The slope meant she could dig into the hillside itself, creating a shelter that was half underground, half above. She started by marking out a rectangle, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep. The arched roof would curve over this space, creating an interior about 7 feet high at the center, sloping down to 5 feet at the walls. It would be small, but small was warmer, and warmth was survival. The digging was brutal work. Margaret used a shovel to cut through the prairie sod, thick, root-bound grass that had been growing for centuries. The sod came up in heavy blocks about 1 foot wide and 3 feet long, weighing 30 pounds each. She'd read about sod houses, how settlers used these blocks like bricks. Daniel helped where he could, pulling loosened sod away, stacking it carefully. He was learning, watching, absorbing technique without being told. Smart boy. Practical. By the end of the second day, Margaret had excavated the back half of the shelter, dug 6 feet into the hillside, creating a space that was already noticeably warmer than the surface. The earth itself was providing insulation, just as the manual had promised. That night, they slept in the wagon, but Margaret lay awake doing calculations. She had enough boards for the door frame and some structural ribs. She had canvas she could tar for weatherproofing. She had tools: an axe, handsaw, mallet, iron nails that had cost a fortune. What she didn't have was time. The weather was turning. She could feel it in the wind, see it in the birds flying south, sense it in her bones. She needed to work faster. On the 3rd day, a man rode up on a bay horse while Margaret was excavating the front half of the shelter. She heard hoofbeats, looked up to see a rider approaching. Instinctively, she moved to put herself between the stranger and Daniel. Her hand found the shovel handle, ready to use it as a weapon if needed. The man stopped 30 feet away, reading her posture correctly. "Didn't mean to startle you, ma'am," he called, voice carrying across the prairie. "I'm your neighbor, Thomas Brennan, homestead 2 miles east." Margaret studied him. Mid-30s, weathered face, work-worn clothes, but clean. Wedding ring visible on his left hand. No, wait. The ring was there, but the finger showed a pale line where another ring had recently been removed. Widower, she realized. Like her. "Margaret Hayes," she said, not lowering the shovel. "This is my son Daniel." Thomas dismounted, kept his hands visible. "I saw your wagon 2 days ago. Wanted to give you time to settle before introducing myself." He looked at the excavation, the piles of sod, the scattered boards. "You're building an arch shelter." It wasn't a question. He recognized what she was doing. "You've seen one before?" Margaret asked. "Built one. 3 years ago when I first came here. Lived in it 2 years before I could afford to build a proper cabin." He gestured at her work. "You're doing it right. The sod blocks, the south face, the hillside position. But you're doing it alone, and winter's coming." Margaret straightened, pride and exhaustion warring in her chest. "I appreciate the observation." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's a polite way of telling me to mind my business." "It is." "Fair enough." He walked to his horse, and Margaret tensed, but he just reached into his saddlebag. "I brought you something. Call it a welcome gift." He held out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Margaret hesitated, then approached. Inside the cloth was dried meat. Venison, well preserved. "I can't pay you," Margaret said. "Didn't ask you to. Frontier courtesy. Someone did the same for me when I arrived." He looked at Daniel, who was watching everything with serious eyes. "How old are you, son?" "8, sir," Daniel said quietly. "Good age. Old enough to learn building." Thomas looked back at Margaret. "I came to offer help. No strings, no expectations, just neighborly assistance. You're trying to build an arch shelter alone in 3 weeks. And that's..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Ambitious." Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to prove she could do this herself, that she didn't need help, especially not from a man. Especially not from a man whose eyes held a kind understanding that made her chest tight with something she couldn't name. But Daniel was watching her, and pride wouldn't keep him warm. "What do you want in return?" she asked bluntly. Thomas met her eyes. "Nothing. My wife died 18 months ago. I know what it's like to try to do everything alone. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Margaret studied his face, looking for deception, for ulterior motive. She found only sincerity and the shared recognition of grief. "Tomorrow," she said, "if the weather holds, you can help with the arch ribs. That's the part I'm least certain about. Thomas nodded. Tomorrow, then? Sunrise? He rode away, and Margaret watched him go, feeling something shift in her chest. Not romance. She'd buried that with John, but perhaps partnership, perhaps possibility. Daniel came to stand beside her. He seems nice. Maybe, Margaret said. We'll see. Thomas arrived at sunrise as promised, bringing additional supplies. 5 bent timber ribs he'd salvaged from his old shelter, rope made from twisted prairie grass, and a bucket of pine tar. The ribs are the hardest part, he explained as they worked. You need them to be curved to form the arch, but strong enough to support weight. Margaret watched as he demonstrated the technique. The ribs were made from young cottonwood saplings, bent into arches and held in that curve by rope lashing. Each rib was about 12 feet long, creating a semicircular arch when the ends were anchored in the ground. You place them every 2 feet, Thomas said, setting the first rib at one end of the excavation. The arch distributes weight along the curve. Snow piles up, but the shape sheds most of it, and the weight that remains gets spread out. It's actually stronger than a flat roof with less material. Daniel helped, steadying the ribs while Thomas anchored them. Margaret cut and fitted cross pieces, smaller branches, lashed horizontally across the ribs to create a framework. The work was technical and demanded precision. Each rib had to be exactly the same curve, positioned exactly vertical, anchored exactly deep enough. Thomas worked patiently, explaining each step, treating Daniel like a capable assistant rather than a child. By midday, they had all 7 ribs installed, creating a skeletal tunnel over the excavated space. The structure already looked like something, no longer just a hole in the ground, but the bones of a shelter. They broke for the midday meal, bread Margaret had baked in a Dutch oven, water from the creek. They sat on stacked sod blocks, the November sun weak but present. You know construction, Thomas observed. This isn't your first building project. My husband was a carpenter, Margaret said. I helped him. Learned by watching, by holding boards, by asking questions. She paused. He taught me to think through structure, to see how pieces fit together. Good skill to have. Didn't save him from cholera. Thomas was quiet a moment. No, practical skills don't protect against everything. My Catherine knew herbs, could doctor most ailments, still couldn't save herself from childbed fever. They sat in shared understanding of loss, of the cruel randomness of frontier death, of surviving when you weren't sure you wanted to. Daniel broke the silence. Mama, what goes over the ribs? Practical question. Margaret appreciated it. Shingles first, she said, then tarred canvas, then sod for insulation. I can help with shingles, Thomas offered. I've got cedar shakes I'm not using. Made them last year, too many for my cabin repair. Margaret started to refuse, then stopped. This was help offered freely, no debt demanded. Learning to accept it was its own kind of strength. Thank you, she said. That would help significantly. Thomas smiled, and Margaret noticed for the first time that it was a good smile. Open. Honest. The kind of smile that made you want to smile back. She looked away quickly, focusing on Daniel. Not yet, maybe not ever, but the possibility was there, quiet and patient. The shingle work took 3 days. Thomas brought hundreds of cedar shakes, thin wooden shingles he'd split from logs using a froe and mallet, each one carefully shaped to overlap properly. They laid them over the curved ribs in overlapping rows, starting at the bottom and working up, each row covering the nails of the previous row. The technique required precision. Each shingle had to overlap the one below by at least 2 inches to create a watertight seal. Too little overlap and water would leak through. Too much and the weight would be excessive. Margaret learned to gauge it by eye, checking frequently, adjusting when needed. Margaret learned the rhythm. Place shingle, check overlap, nail twice with hand-forged iron nails, move to next. Daniel helped hand shingles up, learning to anticipate which size was needed next, developing an understanding of construction sequencing. "Why cedar?" Daniel asked, watching his mother nail another shake into place. "Resists rot," Thomas explained, steadying a bundle for Margaret to reach. "Water runs off it clean. Pine or cottonwood would rot within 2 years. Cedar can last a decade or more." "How long will the shelter last?" "Built right? 10 years, maybe more. Long enough for your mother to save money for a bigger cabin if she wants one." Daniel looked at Margaret, uncertainty crossing his face. "Will we build a bigger cabin?" "Eventually," Margaret said, pausing her work to meet his eyes. "But this shelter will keep us alive this winter. That's what matters now. We build for survival first, comfort later." By the 4th day of work, the arched frame was completely covered with shingles, creating a watertight outer layer. The structure looked like a giant overturned boat, half buried in the hillside. Next came the tarred canvas. Margaret heated pine tar in an iron pot over a fire, carefully painting it onto heavy canvas sheets. The tar made the canvas completely waterproof and surprisingly rigid. They stretched the tarred canvas over the shingles, securing it with wooden battens nailed through to the ribs beneath. This created a double layer of water protection. The shingles beneath would shed most water, but the tarred canvas above would catch anything that leaked through. Finally came the sod. They took the heavy grass blocks Margaret had cut during excavation and laid them like bricks over the entire curved structure. The sod went on thick, 6 inches at the sides, 8 inches over the top. Each block weighed 30 pounds, and they placed hundreds of them. "The sod does 3 things," Thomas explained to Daniel as they worked. "First, it insulates. Grass and roots trap air, air stays warm. Second, it adds weight, which holds everything down in wind. Third, it grows back into itself, creating a living roof that gets stronger over time." Daniel helped pack soil around each block, learning to overlap them so water would run down and away rather than through. He was strong for 8, and he worked without complaining, even when his hands were numb from cold. On the 6th day, they built the walls. The back half of the shelter was already dug into the hillside, earth walls that needed only plastering. Margaret mixed clay from the creek bank with chopped straw and water, creating a plaster they troweled onto the earthen walls. The clay and straw mixture dried hard and smooth, sealing the walls against moisture. The front half needed built walls. They used the remaining sod blocks to construct knee-high walls on each side of the entrance, then filled the space between the arched roof and these low walls with a mixture of wood framing and more clay plaster. The door was simple. Boards Thomas had brought, fitted into a frame, hung on leather hinges. It swung inward and could be barred from inside with a wooden plank. Windows were the luxury. Margaret had saved money for 2 small window openings, just 18 inches square, with wooden shutters that could be latched closed from inside. No glass, but the shutters could be opened for light and air in good weather, closed for warmth in winter. By the 7th day, the shelter was complete. Margaret stood back with Thomas and Daniel, looking at what they'd built. The structure was beautiful in its practicality. A half-buried arch rising from the hillside, covered with sod that already showed green grass growing, small windows like eyes, smoke from the small chimney they'd built using clay and stones. "It's remarkable," Thomas said quietly. "You designed this from a book description?" And modification, Margaret admitted. The book didn't include the double-layer roofing or the clay wall plaster. Those were my additions. They're good additions. This shelter will outlast most timber cabins. Margaret felt a surge of pride. She'd done this. With help, yes, but she'd planned it, designed it, made decisions, solved problems. She'd built shelter for her son. "Mama," Daniel said, voice excited, "can we sleep inside tonight?" Margaret looked at the shelter, at the door that closed, at the walls that would hold back winter, at the proof that they would survive. "Yes," she said, "tonight we sleep in our home." The interior was 16 feet by 12 feet, small but efficiently designed. Margaret had built sleeping platforms along both side walls using boards over sod block supports. A small clay and stone fireplace occupied the back corner, with a chimney made from stones mortared with clay, rising through the arched roof. The ceiling was just over 7 feet at the center of the arch, sloping down to 5 feet at the walls. But the curved shape felt spacious rather than cramped, and the half-buried design meant the floor was naturally warmer than surface level. Thomas helped her build a small table and 2 stools from split logs. She made shelves from boards and rope. She hung dried herbs and their few possessions from pegs driven into the walls. That first evening in the shelter, with the fire burning and the door barred against the November wind, Margaret felt something unfamiliar. Safety. Daniel sat on his sleeping platform, arranging his few possessions: a wooden horse his father had carved, a slate for writing, a book of frontier poetry. He looked up, and for the first time in months, Margaret saw peace on his face. "It's warm, Mama." "It is? Will Mr. Brennan come back?" Margaret considered. Thomas had said goodbye that afternoon, returning to his own homestead, but his farewell had included an invitation. "If you need anything this winter, I'm 2 miles east, and if you'd like company on Sundays, you're both welcome at my table." "Maybe," Margaret said. "Would you like that?" Daniel was quiet, thinking seriously. "I miss having a father, but I don't want a new father. Papa was Papa." "I know, sweetheart. But Mr. Brennan is nice, and he knows things, and he makes you smile." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Does he?" "Yes. You smiled more the last week than you have since Papa died." Margaret pulled Daniel close, holding him in the warm shelter they'd built together. Outside, wind howled across the prairie. Inside, the fire burned steady. "We're going to be all right," she said. "We built something strong. We survived. And maybe, in time, we'll do more than just survive." Daniel nodded against her shoulder, trusting, safe. The first real winter storm came a week later. 3 days of howling wind and driving snow that buried the prairie in white and dropped temperatures until breathing hurt. Inside the earth-bermed shelter, Margaret and Daniel stayed warm. The arched design shed snow exactly as planned. The curved roof allowed the wind to slide over rather than press down, and accumulated snow added insulation rather than dangerous weight. The earth banking kept the interior temperature remarkably stable, never warm enough to be comfortable without the fire, but never cold enough to threaten frost. They burned less wood than Margaret had feared. The thermal mass of earth surrounding them held heat from the fire, releasing it slowly through the night. One fire in the evening lasted until morning, keeping the shelter livable. On Sunday after the storm, Thomas rode up with fresh bread and news. "Wanted to make sure you weathered the storm," he said, though his eyes said more. Margaret invited him inside, and he looked around the shelter with professional appreciation. Brilliant design. The earth banking worked perfectly. This is warmer than my cabin. The arch distributes the load, Margaret explained, pointing out the structural elements. And being partially underground means we're below the frost line. The earth itself moderates temperature. You should write this down. Document the construction. Other settlers would benefit. Margaret hadn't considered that, her innovation as something worth sharing. But Thomas was right. She'd solved a problem many faced: how to build shelter in treeless country with limited resources. I could draw plans, she said slowly. Write instructions. Maybe submit them to a Homestead Gazette. You should. Thomas paused, then said carefully, I came to ask if you and Daniel would like to share Christmas dinner at my cabin. I'm a terrible cook, but I have venison and supplies, and it seemed... He trailed off, vulnerable in a way that made Margaret's chest tight. Lonely, she finished. Christmas alone seems lonely. Yes. Margaret looked at Daniel, who was watching both adults with interest. We'd like that, she said. Thank you. Thomas's smile was bright enough to warm the entire shelter. Christmas came cold and clear. Margaret and Daniel walked the 2 miles to Thomas's cabin, carrying the seed cakes she'd made and feeling nervous. Thomas's cabin was conventional, log walls, plank roof, but well-built and tidy. He'd clearly made an effort. The table was set with his best dishes. A small evergreen branch decorated one corner, and he'd roasted the venison perfectly. They ate together, talking about farming, about spring plans, about the small details of frontier life. Daniel asked Thomas about carpentry, and Thomas answered patiently, treating the boy's questions with respect. After dinner, while Daniel explored Thomas's small bookshelf, Thomas and Margaret sat by the fire. I've been thinking, Thomas said carefully, about partnership. Margaret's heart jumped. Partnership? Not marriage, not yet, maybe not ever, if that's not what you want. But practical partnership. I have land, you have land. I know timber framing, you know earth construction. I can hunt, you can plant. Together, we could build something more stable than either of us can build alone. Margaret studied his face. Honest, practical, offering collaboration, not possession. What would this partnership look like? Shared work on both properties, shared resources, teaching Daniel carpentry while you document your arch shelter design, helping each other survive and maybe in time, thrive. He paused. And if friendship becomes more, we could consider that. But only if you want. Margaret thought about the last months. The loneliness, the fear, the weight of responsibility. She thought about the week of building, when work was shared and burden was lighter. She thought about Daniel, who needed male guidance, but also needed his mother strong and independent. Partnership, she said slowly, with clear terms, written down, so we both know expectations. Agreed. And Daniel's well-being comes first, always. Of course. And I maintain ownership of my land. I won't become someone's property. I wouldn't ask you to. Thomas held out his hand. Partners? Margaret looked at his hand, calloused from work, steady, offered without pressure. She thought about trust, about risk, about the slow building of something new from the broken pieces of something lost. She took his hand. Partners. Daniel looked up from the book he was reading, saw the handshake, and smiled. Spring came, and with it, growth. Margaret's arch shelter proved its worth through the winter. The design stayed warm with minimal fuel, shed snow perfectly, and required almost no maintenance. Other homesteaders heard about it and came to see, bringing questions. Margaret drew detailed plans and wrote construction instructions. With Thomas's encouragement, she submitted them to the Homestead Gazette, which published them in March with the headline, innovative earth-bermed shelter design by Mrs. M. Hayes, Dakota Territory. 3 families built versions of her shelter that spring. The design spread across treeless regions, adapted and modified, credited back to Margaret's original concept. The partnership with Thomas evolved slowly, carefully. He helped her break sod for crops. She taught him her planting techniques. He showed Daniel advanced carpentry. She shared meals and conversation. One evening in May, sitting outside the art shelter as the sun set over endless prairie grass turning gold in the fading light, Thomas said quietly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Margaret's breath caught. She'd felt it too. The slow warming, the increasing trust, the way her chest felt light when she saw him riding toward her property across the valley. She'd been afraid to name it, afraid that naming it would make it vulnerable, would invite loss again. But she was tired of fear dictating her life. "I think," she said carefully, choosing each word, "I might be falling in love with you too, but slowly, carefully, like building something that needs to last." "Slowly is fine," Thomas said, and his voice held relief and patience in equal measure. "We have time. We're not children rushing into things. We're adults who've both lost everything once. We can build this right." Daniel, sitting nearby, whittling a piece of wood with Thomas's pocket knife, a gift the boy treasured, said without looking up, "Are you going to get married?" Both adults laughed. "Someday, maybe," Margaret said. "Would that be all right with you?" Daniel considered seriously. "Only if we can still live in the art shelter sometimes. It's the best house I've ever had." Margaret pulled him close. "Deal." The art shelter stood for 14 years. Margaret and Thomas married in 1869, combined their homesteads, and built a larger cabin together. But they kept the shelter, using it for storage, for guests, and sometimes just for the memory of what Margaret had accomplished alone. Daniel grew up learning both carpentry and innovation, eventually becoming a builder known for creative solutions to frontier challenges. He always credited his mother. "She taught me that the right way isn't always the only way, and sometimes the best solution comes from working with what you have instead of wishing for what you don't." Margaret's shelter design was published in 3 agricultural journals and 1 engineering manual. Across Dakota Territory and beyond, versions of her earth-bermed arch shelter provided homes for families who couldn't afford timber or didn't have access to trees. On winter evenings, when grandchildren asked Margaret to tell stories, she'd tell them about the autumn she arrived in Dakota with nothing but a wagon, a sun, and a book with rough sketches. How she'd looked at treeless prairie and seen not limitation, but possibility. How she'd built shelter using earth and innovation and the patient help of a good man. "The arch," she'd say, "isn't just about structure. It's about how curved strength can hold up where straight lines fail. It's about working with nature instead of against it, and it's about building something that lasts." The grandchildren would look at her, this formidable woman who'd homesteaded alone, who'd invented and built and survived. And they'd understand that strength came in many forms, and the strongest form was often the one that knew when to curve rather than break. The shelter itself eventually collapsed in 1881, the timbers finally rotting through. But by then, Margaret Hayes Brennan had built something more permanent, a legacy of innovation, a family of survivors, and proof that the frontier wasn't conquered by force, but by intelligence, adaptation, and the quiet stubbornness of people who refused to accept that anything was impossible.